Now I'd like to invite Ms. Amy Celico for her luncheon speech, and then Dr. Liu again, I give you another task to moderate the discussion. Thank you. Welcome.
I know that you are all enjoying your lunch and networking, but we do have a very exciting lunch speaker. So I want to quickly introduce her. So if you look at all the speakers this morning, they're either active government official like Xi Xueyuan, or they are former government officials like Dennis Wilder, or academics. But our speaker basically is a combination of all. So she started, of course, as a college student. I checked, and her aspiration was to become a historian of China. And then something happened. I don't know what happened, but Amy will be able to share with us that she stopped pursuing the academic dream and joined the Foreign Service. And that is a very exciting career. Very rarely you run into someone who had worked at 4 U.S. government agencies. So at the Commerce, at USTR, at Defense, and at State. And then she was telling somebody that in 2007, she suddenly decided she's going to Shanghai. So she left her rising career at the federal government and decided to work in the private sector. And in the private sector, of course, she got to work with Secretary Madeleine Albright, day in, day out. So, and then she also worked, I don't know for how long, at what Professor Lambton talked about, the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center as a chief, the program developer over there. And so that's the academic part of it. So the combination of all three, I think her perspective on this relationship, her career, and the rise and the fall of the relationship, I think they're all intimately and very tightly interconnected. So we will hear from Amy Celico on her perspectives, where this relationship is and where this relationship is going to go to, and what role she will play, big or small. So the floor is yours, Amy.
Thank you so much, Yawei, for that kind introduction. So often, in my current role as a partner at Albright Stonebridge Group, I'm discussing China with business community members. And so, of course, I refer to myself as a one-trick pony because all I've ever done in my 30-year career is China. But here I am standing before all of you, and of course, most of you outdo me on that. But I do think as what I'm going to talk about today, we've heard a lot, and I was listening in by Zoom throughout the morning and really appreciated all of the remarks, the call out to the Hopkins Nanjing Center, of which I'm a proud alumna and former employee, thanks to my professor, Mike Lambton, and mentor. I thought I would talk a little bit about where the relationship could go in the short term. But I do want to put a little context around Yawei's very generous introduction and talk about me watching U.S. China relations from my perch in academia, as a student at Johns Hopkins, and then in the U.S. government, and now, of course, for the past 16 years in the business community. And so I think it's interesting when I think back, I was working in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing in the summer of 1997 when Hong Kong returned, of course, to China. I was at our consulate in Shanghai when China acceded to the WTO in 2001, and prior to that, as Dennis Wilder mentioned this morning, President Bush traveled to join the APEC summit in Shanghai. I was a lowly control officer for many of the events there. That, of course, was the same year that the EP3 incident happened in China. And, you know, watching the way that our two countries were able to manage a very, very difficult event is remarkable today, because I think all of us would shudder to think what would happen if there were some kind of military accident between our two countries today. But back then, in the spring of 2001, of course, China wanted to join the World Trade Organization. The United States was a major supporter of that, and we were trying to finalize negotiations. The business community was a major promoter of that. China was going to be hosting APEC that fall, and so there were so many reasons between the two governments to manage that crisis that happened when there was an accident. And of course, a Chinese pilot's life was lost and American airmen landed on Hainan Island. Thinking back on it, that those American service members were sent back home with no problem, the plane eventually was sent home, is something that we all need to aspire to again today. I was working at the International Monetary Fund when I was prior to going to SAIS, and seeing just how important China's ambitions were to become a member of the global economy, integrated with the global system. That motivated me to leave behind my aspiration to become a Chinese historian. I'm sure I would have been a poor one, but I was a very interested and avid undergraduate student of modern Chinese history. But I really did, working for the People's Bank of China at the International Monetary Fund, get this window into how serious the Chinese government was about its opportunities as an economic superpower. I think even then, this was in the mid-90s, there were these ambitions for China really to take its rightful place as the second largest economy in the world, and of course, probably in my lifetime, the largest economy in the world. And of course, this past year, as a member of the business community, I've watched the U.S. China bilateral trade relationship top $700 billion, an incredible number amidst all the tensions that we rightly talk about and focus on. There is such an incredibly important economic relationship between our two countries. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be protected. It needs also to take into consideration national security issues that will limit its continued development in some ways. But I'm a firm believer that if we're going to have a small yard and high fence, we need to work together to set those limits on the bilateral relationship and not just impose our views on the other without actually having real consultations about cost benefits, about national security considerations, and about the larger impetus that I think so many of us still lean on for the U.S. and China to have some kind of ballast in this relationship that, of course, will continue to weather so many storms. So in my remarks, I'd just like to touch on three topics before we sit down to a conversation. And the first being what everybody else has been talking about at this fantastic program. And thank you again, Dr. Hong. I think ICAS has put together such a rich program today. I've taken so much away from it. First and foremost, I have to say what Professor Lampton said this morning, helping us think in a straightforward, realistic, and honest way about the limits that we are placing in some ways on ourselves through our government's interactions and the lens through which our governments look at one another. So I want to talk a little bit about the official relationship and what are the signposts that perhaps we should be looking for to see if we really can see some stabilization in the relationship in the short term going into 2024, a year we know is going to be a difficult year for the relationship. I would like to touch upon the issue that I work on day in and day out, and that is how geopolitical and economic issues are impacting American companies operating in the China market, because I think the American business community, just like the Chinese business community, are very important stakeholders in promoting the benefits of the relationship. And as you've heard from others, and as you'll hear from me, of course, there is lowered levels of optimism on both sides about the trade and investment flows that our two countries can see in this current environment. And then finally, I want to just end with thinking about what this means for us. None of us are members of the U.S. or Chinese governments. And so what is our role as advocates for stabilization in a relationship that won't look like the good old days that I fully appreciate, remember, and look back on so fondly. But what is it that our two countries can come together and create through us, through people advocating for some kind of accommodation, some kind of cooperation, amidst a very clear-eyed view of where the limitations will remain in certain areas. So I thought I would start off talking just very briefly about some of the signposts that I think we're going to be looking at, even as quickly as this week in the U.S., to give us an idea of when President Xi, and we really are, knock on wood, hoping that President Xi comes to San Francisco in a few weeks from now. But I think this week is a good place to start. Of course, the Belt and Road Forum happening in Beijing. Right now, the over 100 countries that are represented there, and the conversations that President Xi is having with global leaders that in some ways are tearing apart this idea of the U.S. and China coming together. There's been a lot of focus on what President Xi and President Putin have said about the war in Israel. And I think, as we heard repeatedly this morning, that is a litmus test for this relationship, how we can talk about, atrocities committed and the work of a terrorist organization. And I do think it's also an opportunity for our two countries to come together because we are both so very interested in that region of the world. We both have relationships, we both have interests that we want to maintain. That is an opportunity for us, although I have to say we've gotten off to a really bad start. And so seeing what else comes out of the Belt and Road Forum and on the sidelines of it, China's meetings with foreign government officials, China's remarks on the crisis in Israel. As Dennis Wilder said this morning, I think China has already moved some, and my hope is that they'll move further. But I don't just want to focus on Beijing this week. I want to focus on what's going to happen next week here in Washington, this week in Washington as well, and that is, of course, that the European Commission's two top leaders, the President and the Commissioner, are both coming to Washington, D.C. for a U.S.-EU dialogue. And what we're understanding about that two-day summit that's about to happen, a lot of it is going to be about China. Unsurprising, as many have said today, these issues around global supply chains and resilience, redundancy, de-risking are all going to be part of that discussion, but so will Israel, so will Ukraine, and so will Taiwan, be issues that these three leaders, President Biden and these two European Commission leaders, will be talking about. And I think what's important for all of us to listen is where is the part of the conversation that will be focused on what we can do with China together. And where China, as so many other speakers have said, is so critically important in dealing with global issues of concern. And we can come back to the same issues that I just said, but there's others as well. And then, of course, we're looking at the sidelines of the APEC meeting. Of course, Foreign Minister Wang Yi will be here, we hope, first next week, laying the groundwork for President Xi to arrive. Fully agree with my colleague Paul Triolo, who mentioned that today's announcements coming out of the Commerce Department shouldn't be derailing opportunities either for the foreign minister to come here or, of course, for President Xi. These updates to these October 7th rules have been known about for quite some time, and the U.S. government has been coordinating with China so that there's no surprise in the lead up to President Xi. Clearly, as would be the case of any global leader doesn't want to be embarrassed and surprised before he comes to the United States. And I think that kind of courtesy and that kind of planning is what our two leaders need to come out of APEC with as well. And I think on that, we really do need to see a shift in the rhetoric coming out of Washington and coming out of Beijing in talking about the global competition that the U.S. and China will continue to wage, but not as a zero-sum game. And although I totally agreed with Bill Reich in talking about the analogy of the marathon, you can either win by running faster or tripping the other guy. I think that is a very poor analogy for how competition with China should operate. I think we should talk about our interests, our shared interests, but then our diverging interests, and still try to accommodate one another. Some of this is very difficult because among the biggest cheerleaders here in Washington for the bilateral relationship for so many years have been the business community that has seen so much growth in commercial opportunities in China and so much future potential in the China market. But let me just read for you the very beginning of the U.S. China Business Council's latest survey conducted of American companies on the ground in China. And this is in the introduction, in fact, the first paragraph. Geopolitics is the single largest issue weighing down business sentiment over the long term. Continued deterioration in U.S.-China relationship over the last 12 months has led to uncertainty, lost sales, and rising costs for more U.S.-China Business Council member companies than ever before. Bilateral tensions, among other factors, are contributing to delayed or canceled investments in China, and while very few firms plan to exit the China market, many companies are adjusting their China-specific business operations, strategies, and supply chains to mitigate the impact of increasing tension. The American Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce also came out with their annual surveys of operating in the China market and had very similar results, saying that geopolitical tensions, China's uncertain environment for companies operating on the ground because of regulatory opacity, national security overlay on trade and economic policies, have weighed on them more than ever before, leading to lower optimism about their 5-year outlooks. And so for the American business community, it needs to continue to advocate in Beijing in order to continue to have what it wants to have, which is opportunity to continue to grow, to innovate, to source from China, to manufacture in China, and of course to sell to Chinese consumers. That does require changes in Beijing. But as Paul talked about in his remarks, it's not just Beijing that is inhibiting American and European business in China. Of course, it's American policy too. And it is this idea of a small yard, high fence, but the yard getting bigger and bigger, and the rhetoric coming out of U.S. government officials that in some way do continue to reiterate that for American national interest, there is a reason to continue to limit the trade and investment relationship. I think that, lest I just continue being negative, I do want to point to a couple areas where the U.S. business community, the U.S. government, together with Chinese counterparts in the business community in Beijing, public policy world, can look at very discrete areas to try to change that narrative, even if it's amidst a very difficult environment. As we all know, fentanyl is a very significant issue for the United States. The use of this illicit drug in the United States is an American problem and one that we need to deal with head-on here in the United States. But the supply of fentanyl coming in mainly through Mexico, with precursor drugs going from China to Mexico, is a massive problem for every American politician because this issue is impacting every community across the United States. I think distinct from somebody earlier who mentioned the increased sanctions on Chinese businesses, actually see that as a positive thing. I think rather than blaming the Chinese government for some grand policy of exporting fentanyl to other countries, I think targeting individual bad actors, whether they're in Mexico, they're in Beijing, or they're in the United States facilitating the importation of these products. That's the way we talk seriously about changing a problem and give China credit for working with us to target companies that are contravening at least the spirit of China's past cooperative agreements with the United States to stem the tide of fentanyl trade. Another area where I think we need to look more closely at, and I think it would be useful for the business community to talk more about, are these issues around data controls. Of course, it's one of the top issues that the American and European business community talks about on the ground in China. China's restrictions on data flows, China's enhanced enforcement of data within China, the collection of data, is a very significant issue for trade and investment. However, the fact that the Cybersecurity Administration of China 2 weeks ago published a draft law that would loosen many of the regulations and introduce a negative list approach to what should be restrictive, i.e., everything's allowed unless we say it can't cross borders. These types of data is a real positive development. This rule was released for public comment. Many of our clients have submitted comments either through their industry associations or directly to the Cybersecurity Administration. And this is the kind of move that the U.S. government should be suggesting is a move in the right direction for one of the main issues that American businesses have brought to the U.S. government that is impacting them on the ground in China. And so just in closing, I'd love to get to some questions. I just want to talk about what we all can do outside of the government. And it's following on what I was just talking about. You don't have to be a member of the U.S. business community to want to be an advocate for a return to an overwhelming support for the U.S. and China to have a stable relationship. Advocacy isn't just for business interests or for profit from Chinese companies or American companies. For all of us in this room who aren't in the U.S. government, we have a role in explaining to our public communities across the United States and across China where is the value in U.S. China relations having less tension around them, less uncertainty around them, and how do we benefit from some enhanced areas of cooperation between our two countries. We've already heard from so many of the speakers individual areas, whether it's S&T cooperation or it's national security issues to reduce the risk of unintended accidents or incidents occurring. But this is one thing that doesn't have to be limited to government action. It has to be enhanced among us in talking about this trust deficit that doesn't just exist between our two governments. Unfortunately, as we all know, it is seeping across our countries, the United States and China, as we look at one another through this lens of increased suspicion. And so I just want to end this conference as we talk about continued challenges in 2024 that we know we're going to face. I think if some of those signposts I mentioned around APEC, around the EU-US summit, around Israel, if we see positive developments, we should be among the people saying, let's take advantage of that low-hanging fruit. Let's applaud some small steps, even if they're not getting to these major strategic issues that our two countries face. We can't sit back and do nothing and expect that the relationship can moderate itself. We have to be a part of that discussion. I'd love to talk more about it through your questions. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and any questions from the floor? Yep, Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Thanks again for Nong, our dear friend. and also your team for putting together this fabulous conference. And my name is Jia Wang. I'm currently the Deputy Director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. So I did fly in from Western Canada without my cowboy hat. And Nong is also a dear friend and a colleague. She also is our senior fellow, research fellow at the China Institute, and my mentor Gordon Holden is here as well. So we are a policy research think tank. We think about Canada-China issues and also China's diplomacy and China's role globally, economically, and also otherwise. And of course, I very much appreciate your excellent presentation. And as we think about what we can do to potentially help improve relationship, but maybe more importantly to help avoid a major conflict, it's something we have been thinking about. And recently, just this year, we did a survey of the Chinese public of their views, their global views, including the U.S. and other major powers. Of course, Canada is part of that as well. And we find it's really fascinating. There's some, of course, worrying trends, but also there are some positives. Maybe I'd like to just share a little bit and then see maybe this is an area we can also help to work on. Is when we ask the Chinese public what is the area or areas that China, they perceive, should play a leading role on the global stage. And the number one subject or area is global peace and security. So for the Chinese public, that's overwhelmingly the most important thing. They hope China will take a leadership role in. And the second one, although that could be a little troubling, is China should take leadership in global development of science and technology. Or technology and innovation. China should be a leader in that. And when we ask in our Canada-China session, what are the barriers to improving Canada-China relations? One of the main barriers, or more importantly, what is a main barrier is, of course, Chinese see Canada as a follower of the U.S. So that's like a barrier improving Canada-China relations. But when it comes to, I think, more importantly, what is not a barrier in improving China-Canada relations, according to the Chinese public, is the value differences. The differences in values, the differences in our systems, at least according to the Chinese public, is not a main barrier. And from that survey, although the Chinese public are a little worry about what is going on in the world, especially during COVID and a lot of isolation, there are concerned about how China is being viewed, but they still have a sense of engagement, pro-engagement, and the majority of the Chinese population still wish to engage with the West, including the US and Canada and many other countries we asked. So out of all the negatives, I think a couple findings through that survey can serve as a positive, and how can we leverage, how can we maybe better understand that, and perhaps use that information to work to find a path forward. Just sort of my question and my comments.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's very interesting. I too, when I went back to China for the first time since COVID in May and June, tried to spend as much time as possible with old friends, Hopkins Nanjing Center classmates, former government interlocutors who are now out of government, just to try to get a sense from people of what are their views of the United States. And of course, here sitting in the bubble of Washington, D.C., it's pretty dark, when you talk to Americans about their views towards China, and again, in this bubble of Washington, D.C., especially so. And I did, on the topics that you're covering here on peace and security and development of science and technology, I heard repeatedly from friends, a view that the United States was, of course, undermining the security of the Indo-Pacific region through our actions around Taiwan, and that there's a widely held view that the United States government wants to keep China from continuing to innovate and develop. And those are huge challenges for all of us to address. Because I think part of that, we have to unpack what that means. Because if you ask many Americans, and I was just part of a dialogue last week where, there was a conversation about where can economic policy go, and most of the conversation was why it can't happen because of issues around national security and around technology competition. And so these are two major areas where the US and China are not seeing eye to eye. And in fact, our government's policies are then coloring the way that we see one another. And so, again, I think it is our responsibility to speak in a straightforward manner to respective governments about where policy moves and rhetoric are bleeding into the broader U.S.-China relationship in a very negative way. Just talking about the consequences of how we talk about one another and how we are setting the stage ourselves as policy, not we, but as our policymakers are impacting just the general public's views of one another. And so I really do think that you've hit on key topics where there needs to be more discussion around the Taiwan issue, around technology competition, so that there can be a deeper understanding here in the United States and in China about what that means. And I'll just talk about Taiwan for one more minute. From my perch in the business community, and that is, as many of you know, so many of my clients, major American corporations, foundations, are concerned about what the impact of some kind of geopolitical event would be on their interests in China, and are asking for real planning around it so that they can diversify, de-risk, as Bill Reinsch said in the last panel, leading to a lot of redundancy that it doesn't really make economic sense, but it makes a lot of risk sense. And when my clients are asked, when they're looking at their presence in China, what could lead to some kind of issue? Taiwan and Russia are the issues around Ukraine. If the Chinese government changed its policy and started to provide support for the Chinese government, that would lead to a lot of multilateral sanctions targeting China. That hasn't happened. We don't anticipate it will happen, but that's a real concern among the U.S. business community, and ditto over Taiwan, some kind of accident or incident around Taiwan. And so I think there's a frenzy that we're about to have some kind of crisis over Taiwan. We are creating that in some ways here in the United States because that view has pervaded so many boardrooms across the United States, and I'm sure Canada as well. And so I will come back to, I think these are very important issues to talk about. Where are the limitations of where we have to compete, and where can we just focus on education to understand these issues better?
Dr. Naj?
Thanks very much, Amy, for a great talk. As I listen to your talk, again, it echoes my comments this morning. I'm wondering if America is looking at this in a too America-centric manner and should be starting to talk to their Japanese friends and their South Korean friends and Southeast Asian friends. Last year, I think Japan and China had $391 billion of bilateral trade. It's by and large equal. There's about 37,000 small and medium-sized enterprises, Japanese enterprises in China. They continue to have a deep interest. South Korea is similar. The bilateral trade relationship between ASEAN and China is almost $1 trillion. So it's the biggest bilateral trading relationship. Is it time for American businesses to start to listen to these different countries and their business federations to see how they're balancing some of the challenges, and where do they see opportunities, and how they're building resilience into their economies? I think it's really useful to start to talk to these other countries because they have more experience. I think they're more culturally similar, and they build long-term relationships that are decades long. And I think this is a really important way to engage with China, and it's not only a lesson for the United States, but also for Canada, where I'm from. So it's just, I'd be interested in your thoughts in listening to how much the American business community does communicate with these other countries and other business federations in terms of how they negotiate the challenges, but also maintain those critical opportunities for success and engagement with China. Thank you.
Well, I should just make clear that in all of these surveys that do have a less optimistic outlook, a more pessimistic outlook, 5 years at the China market, there's also a lot of thought around where are the areas where we can continue to grow, in certain, not in every sector, but in some sectors. And I think that, looking at how Japanese companies, South Korean companies, Vietnamese companies, et cetera, Thai companies continue to grow in the China market is certainly important. But I do think the business communities do coordinate in China. And so I would say some of the challenges about, raids in the market, about detentions of nationals working for Japanese as well as American companies, that's continuing to happen across the board. So I take your point, and I think what I think a lot of our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific would say is, you need to return to a trade agenda in that region in order to compete fairly and in some ways in a positive sense, including with China and other major economies there. And the domestic politics around that, even reducing tariffs with China, is just so difficult around trade questions in general. It's a real constraint, I think, for us that our friends and allies in the region don't face. And so I think you're right. That's why they face fewer problems with their trading relationship. Not that some of the issues don't, but this is where we're tripping ourselves up, I think, here. And that's impacting our ability to operate there.
So one question from online, because when they register, they have questions. So you mentioned about U.S. China Business Council report. You have so many clients. Is it your impression that the business community want to be quiet? They want to do business, but they don't want to go to Congress. Paul mentioned, the chip factory CEOs came to town and lobbied, U.S. government not to have this new document issued, but they were ignored. And so can the business, the business of America is business, right, in the past. So now, has that changed? So the business community are about to say there's nothing they can do, or just try to survive. And then, I was talking to Ambassador Craig Allen. I said, can you get anyone to the Carter Center to talk about U.S.-China business relationship? He said, no one would like to talk about it publicly.
I think publicly is absolutely right. I mean, Paul and I had, 5 or 6 CEOs in China over the past 4 weeks of major American corporations. And so just to underscore, yes, there are challenges operating in the China market, many of them emanating from Washington as well as Beijing, but it's still an incredibly large and important component of our bilateral relationship, just given the size of trade and investment flows. American companies are worried about the ramifications of being seen as continuing to double down in China because of domestic politics here in Washington. Absolutely. There is such a concern that they'll be called to testify before Congress. But before I just continue to say, and so that's the only problem, we also have clients who are facing, regulatory reviews in China where geopolitics is all of a sudden an issue that it never would have been in the past. And so this bleeding of national security and U.S.-China competition into many, many different areas where that U.S. companies have to navigate is harder than ever before. And I think that's why they are loath to talk about it publicly. But I think what the business community will continue to say is we need the U.S. government to support us and not constrain us unduly, because that will impact innovation and competitiveness of the United States on the global stage. And so that's why those companies were in Washington. They didn't succeed in stopping the restrictions, but let's wait and see the implications of some of these restrictions. And if we continue to see the U.S. undermined with our South Korean and Japanese competitors because we face restrictions that they do not vis-a-vis China, the impact on our economy. And so I think the business community is going to continue to knock on the doors of the U.S. government and Beijing and saying, you know, we want to continue to grow in this market. This requires that data, you know, localization law to be loosened, cross-border data flow law to be loosened, or else it's too expensive and unwieldy and difficult for us to continue to operate in the market. But I think even in Beijing, Yawei, companies don't really want to be in the press there either, because they know this is a contentious part of the relationship rather than just the ballast, the stabilizing force, the very good area in U.S. China cooperation. It's the tip of the spear of many areas of U.S. China competition now.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And many American media and experts now are talking about the so-called peak China or even collapsing China. And President Biden was talking about the ticking time bomb of Chinese economy. How would you assess the situation of Chinese economy, and how would that impact on the U.S.-China relations? I believe that will impact on the kinds of strategy of competition or even cooperation. So how would that impact on the U.S.-China relations? Thank you.
Sadly, I'm not an economist, but I did hear the earlier Yukon Huang's comments on the Chinese economy, and I really just want to reinforce what he said. Unfortunately, many of the things that are a drag on China's economic growth are some of the policies that are dragging the private sector down. And so we continue to see that too. And what we're all waiting to see, as I think Yukon really accurately described what we've seen this year in the post-COVID restriction recovery, and then it really stalling out. Now, of course, all the talk is China is about to release stimulus. When I was in Hong Kong and Beijing in May, there was such pessimism because the government was refusing to talk about stimulus. And then that changed. It started to change in June, but now it does seem like they're going to take some significant steps to try in the short term to help a rebounding growth. But the challenges aren't cyclical, they are structural. And so they are going to require some very, very difficult steps being taken by the Chinese government. And that will reinforce the interest among foreign investors to continue to be in China. The Chinese government rhetorically has said they're going to continue to open up because there's such a role for foreign investment in helping with this recovery. But we need to see more than just talk. We need to see some action on what that actually will mean.
I think that actually wraps up our lunch speech, and shall we thank Amy for sharing her views with us, and Hong Kong is going to conclude the annual meeting of ICAS.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Liu, and thank you especially to Ms. Amy Celico for the wonderful speech and remark following that. So as Dr. Liu mentioned, Amy has gone through a career path from government, from business, from policy, education, academia, which has been very well. That are the areas that we need to further understanding the better relationship between China and United States. And then I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you, our panelists and our attendees for very insightful and enlightening discussions. I recall last year when we conclude our annual conference, we raised the question whether we're going to see a more hopeful or a more prospect on the U.S. China relations in 2023. And that question remains still hanging when we try to conclude this year's annual conference. So hopefully in the next annual conference, which marks the 10th anniversary of ICAS, and we don't need to ask the same question again. So I want to recall Dr. mentioned in his opening remark, he said, I quote here, and he said, it's the hope that the annual conference will once again throw out vibrant ideas and solutions to the many challenges being faced, and also articulate a new paradigm of ties to relaunch the U.S. China relations. I'm not quite sure we have achieved this goal today, but ICAS as an independent think tank with a major mission to promote the exchange of research and policy on the U.S. China relations, we committed, will continue our role to facilitate a further mutual understanding in the near future. So I think that's bring to the end of this conference. Please join me in thanking all our panelists and Luncheon and keynote speakers, and Dr. Lam tends to be very joining us for the whole program. We appreciate that. And all thanks to all participants, virtually here and online. We still have a lot of participants online from China and from Europe, and we can see from the registration link. And thanks to my colleague in ICAS for putting a lot of efforts to putting for logistic arrangement, etc. And I would like to thank our also co-host and for working with ICAS for many years. And looking forward to seeing everybody next year when we celebrate our 10 years anniversary. Thank you very much, everyone.